What does it mean to fear something you cannot see, cannot name, and cannot fight with your hands? Long before hospitals, microscopes, or written warnings carved into stone, human beings were already living beside invisible companions. They moved with us through grasslands and river valleys. They waited in shared breath, in wounded skin, in standing water, in the warmth of crowded shelters. We did not know they were there. We only knew that sometimes the strong began to fade, the young developed fevers without reason, and the familiar face across the fire slowly became altered by forces no one could explain. It is tempting to imagine prehistory as a struggle against visible dangers alone. Teeth in the dark, winter hunger, the violence of storms. But another world was always present, quieter and more intimate. A world of organisms too small to see, yet powerful enough to bend spines, scar skin, drain strength, and empty whole dwellings in silence. These were not simply medical events before medicine. They were part of the human condition before language had the tools to describe them. And still, the archaeological record offers something more than suffering. In burial after burial, among damaged bones and hurried graves, there are signs of care. Someone stayed. Someone carried water. Someone buried the dead with intention, even when fear must have moved through the living like cold wind. Disease did not only test the body, it tested memory, kinship, and the fragile promise that a community would remain a community when one of its own began to change. What emerges from the earth is not just evidence of ancient illness. It is a portrait of humanity learning, again and again, that survival has never depended on strength alone. It has also depended on how we respond to what we do not understand. And perhaps that has always been the more difficult trial. What happens when an illness does not rush in like a storm, but settles into the body like a long winter? In one ancient burial after another, archaeologists have found the same quiet testimony. Spines bent forward, vertebrae eaten away, rib cages collapsed inward as if the body had been slowly folding into itself. At first glance, such damage can resemble injury, a fall, a blow, the violence of terrain or conflict. But under closer study, the pattern tells a different story. This was not sudden harm. It was a slow occupation from within. Tuberculosis has likely accompanied humanity for far longer than cities, longer than written memory, perhaps even longer than farming itself. It begins in the lungs, often invisibly, and then, in severe cases, travels through the blood to the spine. There it erodes bone over months or years. The result is not just pain, but a reshaping of posture, breath, and daily existence. To rise becomes difficult. To carry weight becomes agony. Even sitting near a fire might have required endurance few could imagine. And yet the most moving detail is not the disease itself. It is the evidence that many sufferers did not die immediately. Some bones show signs of partial healing. That means they lived with the illness for a long time. They were fed, helped, kept within the circle of the living. In enclosed shelters, that closeness may also have spread the infection further, but early communities had no language for contagion. They only knew that no one survives alone. Perhaps that is what makes tuberculosis feel so ancient and so modern at once. It is not merely a story of infection. It is a story of shared air, shared risk, shared tenderness. A person coughs in the night, another person stays nearby, and somewhere in that moment, human compassion and human vulnerability become impossible to separate. What do people see first when disease changes not the breath, but the face? Leprosy enters history clothed in stigma, but its deeper story begins much earlier. Before law, before scripture, before exile became ritual. In prehistoric graves, researchers have found skulls marked by a haunting pattern. Erosion around the nose, damage to the upper jaw, signs that the face itself had slowly begun to recede. These were not wounds from combat. They were the remains of a disease that altered identity in the most visible way possible. Unlike illnesses that hide in the chest or blood, leprosy reveals itself over time. Nerves lose sensation, hands grow clumsy, small injuries go unfelt, then untreated. The body does not collapse all at once. It changes in increments, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. In a world where survival depended on reading the faces and bodies of those around you, Such transformation would have carried an emotional force beyond pain alone. And still, the graves resist a simple story of rejection. Again and again, individuals bearing signs of the disease were buried with care. They were not always cast aside. Some were placed among others, accompanied by objects that suggest belonging rather than banishment. The evidence hints at a harder truth. Fear may have been present, but so was recognition. The afflicted were still known, still named, still part of the human circle. That may be the quiet lesson hidden in these bones. Stigma is not born fully formed. It develops like disease itself through repetition, misunderstanding, and the stories communities tell to survive what they cannot explain. Before leprosy became a symbol of exclusion, it was simply a condition that changed the body slowly, painfully, and in public view. And perhaps that is why it lingers so powerfully in human memory. It confronts us with an unsettling question. When illness reshapes the surface by which we know one another, what remains strong enough to preserve our sense of shared humanity? When did progress begin to make people sick in entirely new ways? The answer may lie in the moment humanity stopped merely following animals and began living beside them. In the first farming settlements, the distance between human life and animal life narrowed dramatically. Goats, sheep, and cattle were no longer passing through the horizon. They were enclosed, milked, butchered, and brought into the rhythm of daily survival. It was a revolution in food, labor, and settlement. It was also a revolution in disease. Archaeologists studying early agricultural sites have found skeletons marked by chronic inflammation in the lower spine and joints, patterns now associated with brucellosis, a bacterial infection that can pass from livestock into human bodies. Unlike a sudden plague, it arrives as a lingering burden. Fever rises, falls, and returns. The joints ache. Strength disappears without warning. A person may seem to recover, only to be weakened again weeks later. In a farming world where the body itself was the primary tool of survival, such instability could unravel ordinary life. There is something especially poignant about this disease because it emerges not from wilderness, but from intimacy. The same animals that provided milk, detraction, warmth, and predictable food also carried invisible risk. Dung used for fuel, births attended in close quarters, unprocessed milk shared within the household. All of it created a new biological closeness. What looked like security from the outside concealed a changing microbial world within. And yet, like so many ancient illnesses, this one did not erase the bonds of home. The dead were often buried beneath the floors of dwellings, as though, even in illness and death, they remained part of the domestic center. That detail matters. It reminds us that the first farmers were not recklessly inviting danger. They were making the best possible bargain with uncertainty. Agriculture is often described as humanity's great leap forward, but every leap creates a shadow beneath it. In learning to shape the land, we also reshape the pathways through which disease could reach us. The question was never whether domestication would change human destiny. It was what unseen costs would arrive with the harvest. What if some of humanity's oldest infections did not belong to one place at all, but traveled with us, changing form as we changed worlds? Across prehistoric burial grounds, from humid regions to temperate plains, certain bones carry the same quiet distortions, shins thickened and bowed, skulls marked by pitted scars, surfaces remodeled not by violence but by a patient invasion unfolding over years. These traces belong to a family of infections known today through one infamous relative, syphilis. Yet the deeper story is broader and older than any single name. Treponema disease is less a single event than a shifting lineage, a set of bacterial cousins adapting to climate, contact, and custom. In some environments, it may have spread through skin-to-skin touch among children. In others, it likely followed more intimate routes. What matters is that it did not appear all at once in a dramatic historical moment. It seems to have existed in multiple forms, crossing generations so gradually that no one living through it could have seen the whole pattern. The body records that long negotiation. Bone thickens in response. The skull tries to heal what it cannot fully repair. Some individuals survive for years, long enough for the damage itself to settle into a strange kind of permanence. And as with so many ancient illnesses, Their burials do not always suggest rejection. They remained among their people. They endured more than one crisis. They were not reduced to their symptoms. There is something deeply human in that ambiguity. Disease changes its path. Communities change their explanations. Later eras turn one strain into scandal, another into moral warning, but the older evidence resists those simplifications. These infections were part of ordinary life before they became loaded with judgment. They belong not to myth, but to coexistence. Perhaps that is why the story feels so unsettling. It reminds us that some diseases do not arrive as strangers. They evolve beside us, adapting to our habits, our movement, our touch. And by the time we try to assign them an origin, they may already have become part of the long, unfinished history of being human. What if one of prehistory's most common afflictions left almost no mark on bone, only a trail hidden in the body's most private evidence? In dry caves and ancient shelters, archaeologists have sometimes uncovered what looks like ordinary dust or hardened soil. Under a microscope, it becomes something else entirely: preserved human waste, transformed by time into a biological record. Inside those fragments lie the eggs of parasites, tiny sealed forms that once hatched in the human gut and fed on the bodies that carried them. It is a humbling discovery. Some of the oldest human companions were not predators outside the camp, but organisms living quietly within. Roundworms, whipworms, hookworms, and other intestinal parasites likely infected people across vast stretches of prehistory. They did not usually kill with spectacle. They stole strength gradually. They drained nutrients from children already living on narrow margins. They deepened fatigue, weakened muscles, and turned hunger into something more complicated than lack of food. A person could eat and still be diminished. A child could grow, but not fully. That quiet damage may have shaped entire communities. In places without sanitation, where waste lingered near hearths, water sources, or sleeping areas, reinfection would have been constant. Bare feet met contaminated soil. Hands prepared food after touching the ground. The cycle repeated so often that illness may have felt indistinguishable from ordinary life. Weakness was not always recognized as disease. It may simply have seemed like the way the world worked. And yet even here, there are signs of observation. In some ancient remains, researchers have found traces of plants known for their medicinal or antiparasitic properties. No one understood larvae or egg cycles, but people noticed patterns. This root soothed pain. That leaf seemed to help. Across generations, practical knowledge gathered quietly in the space between suffering and survival. Parasites reveal a different kind of prehistoric fear. Not the terror of sudden collapse, but the erosion of vitality so familiar it becomes invisible. They ask a difficult question: how much of human history was shaped not by dramatic catastrophe, but by a constant, unseen draining of the body's strength, accepted simply because no one had ever known a life without it? What does a community do when illness no longer lingers in shadows, but arrives all at once across the skin? Somewhere in the Bronze Age, a fever began to move through human settlements with a different kind of speed. It did not wait years to bend bone or slowly empty the body of strength. It came hot and sudden, then surfaced visibly, marking faces, limbs, and lives in a matter of days. Ancient genetic evidence suggests that an early relative of smallpox was already circulating long before the disease entered written history. Its story, like so many prehistoric stories, survived not in chronicles, but in fragments locked inside human teeth. Smallpox belongs to a brutal category of disease because it leaves little time for explanation. First comes heat, then exhaustion, then the eruption itself, lesions spreading across the skin like a map of suffering no one can read. In close settlements, where families slept near one another and shared air, tools, and touch, such a virus would have moved with terrifying efficiency. A child healthy one week might be unrecognizable the next. Those who survived would carry scars long after the fever was gone. Unlike chronic illness, an outbreak like this reshapes memory quickly. It creates before and after. Before the coughing began, before the rash appeared, before that season when too many people died too close together. Even without written language, communities would have remembered such episodes in story, in caution, in altered habits. The marks left on survivors may have been read as proof of endurance, contamination, fate, or some mystery larger than any household could contain. What makes ancient smallpox so haunting is not only its violence, but its dependence on us. It needs human bodies to continue. It follows our roots, our gatherings, our growing density. In that sense, it is a disease of connection as much as contagion. The more successfully we learned to live together, the more vulnerable we became to what could pass between us. And so the question deepens. When the signs of illness become visible on the surface of the body, does fear grow because death is near, or because survival itself becomes something others can see written on your skin? What if the most dangerous thing in a settlement was the very thing every living creature had to trust? Water gives the illusion of innocence. It reflects light. It cools the skin. It gathers in rivers and shallow wells as if it exists outside suspicion. For prehistoric communities settling near dependable sources, water was not simply useful. It was the center of everything. It nourished crops, sustained animals, and anchored the promise that people could stay in one place long enough to build memory into the land. But under certain conditions, that same lifeline could become a silent instrument of mass death. Archaeologists have uncovered burial pits in ancient settlements where bodies appear to have been placed rapidly, without the usual spacing, ornaments, or care seen in other graves. Men, women, and children lie together in arrangements that suggest urgency rather than ceremony. There are no blade marks, no crushed skulls, no evidence of attack. Instead, there is the eerie signature of a community overtaken too quickly to explain itself. In such moments, modern researchers often look toward waterborne disease. A contaminated river or shallow communal source could spread lethal intestinal infections in days. Diarrhea, cramping, vomiting, dehydration, a body emptied faster than it can recover. In a tightly clustered village, one source of bad water would not create a single tragedy. It would produce a chain reaction. Families drinking from the same place, preparing food with the same hands, returning again and again to the thing they believed was keeping them alive. That is the cruelty of this kind of epidemic. The danger does not look dangerous. Clear water offers no warning. It carries no scent of intention. And without an understanding of invisible contamination, survivors would have had little reason to suspect the river, the basin, or the well. They might have blamed a season, a spirit, an omen in the sky. Perhaps that is why these ancient graves feel so unsettling. They remind us that human beings have long depended on forces that sustain and threaten us at once. The same element that makes settlement possible can, under the wrong conditions, undo it. And when survival depends on trust, how does a community recover after trust itself becomes lethal? How many ancient diseases pass through human history without leaving a scar anyone could see? Some of the most enduring infections do not announce themselves on the skin or carve their names into bone. They work deeper, in blood and tissue, in organs that vanish long before archaeologists ever reach them. For most of human history, such illnesses would have been almost impossible to understand. A person might weaken slowly, lose appetite, tire too easily, grow yellow in the eyes, and then disappear into memory without any outward wound to explain the decline. That is what makes the discovery of ancient hepatitis B so haunting. Modern genetic analysis has recovered traces of the virus from human remains thousands of years old, revealing that it was already moving through prehistoric communities long before medicine had language for the liver, immunity, or viral transmission. It was not an interruption from the future. It was already there, traveling with families, passing quietly through contact, childbirth, and the ordinary accidents of close human life. Unlike epidemic diseases that arrive in visible waves, hepatitis B belongs to the slower category of danger. It can remain silent for years while still spreading from one body to another. In small, settled communities, that silence may have been its greatest advantage. A person did not need to look ill to carry it. A household did not need to witness sudden death to be living inside a pattern of transmission. The infection could become part of a bloodline before anyone recognized there was a pattern at all. There is something deeply sobering about that idea. Not every ancient threat came with panic, mass graves, or outward disfigurement. Some moved softly through generations, shaping health without ever becoming a dramatic event. They remind us that the history of disease is not only the history of catastrophe, it is also the history of hidden persistence. And perhaps that is the harder truth to face. We often fear what arrives loudly. But what if some of the most powerful forces in human history were the ones that stayed quiet long enough to be mistaken for fate itself? What if one of history's most infamous killers spent thousands of years rehearsing before anyone learned its name? For many people, plague belongs to crowded medieval streets, church bells, and the terrible mathematics of sudden death. But the deeper record tells a quieter, older story. Long before the great pandemics entered human memory, ancestral forms of the plague bacterium were already moving through prehistoric populations. Genetic traces recovered from ancient teeth suggest that the organism existed in an earlier state, not yet fully adapted to the flea-borne transmission that would later make it so devastating, but dangerous all the same. That detail changes the emotional shape of the story. It means plague did not erupt from nowhere. It evolved gradually, testing pathways, shifting forms, learning the human landscape over generations. In its earlier versions, it may have spread through close contact or respiratory exposure, rather than through the efficient chain of rodent, flea, and human host that would later fuel catastrophe. Even without that perfected mechanism, it could still move fast enough to terrify a settlement. Imagine the experience from inside such a world. Someone healthy falls ill by evening. Fever rises. The body weakens with alarming speed. Within days, perhaps sooner, a household is transformed into a place of dread. There are no visible enemies at the edge of the firelight, only the unbearable realization that proximity itself may be dangerous. The same closeness that protects a community becomes the avenue through which death enters it. Yet ancient plague remains difficult to see in the archaeological record because it often kills too quickly to mark bone. What survives instead are patterns: clustered deaths, abrupt absences, genetic fragments preserved in teeth like sealed whispers from the body's last defense. Those fragments suggest that the bacterium was traveling alongside human migration long before chronicles existed to accuse it. And that may be the most unsettling thought of all. Some disasters are not sudden arrivals. They are long preparations. By the time history finally notices them, they have already been shaping human lives in silence for millennia. What do we call a catastrophe when the dead remain, but the name of what killed them is gone? Across parts of prehistoric Europe and Asia, archaeologists have uncovered graves that do not behave like ordinary burials. Bodies are layered too quickly. Children lie beside elders, adults beside adolescents, with no visible sign of battle, no fractured skulls, no embedded weapons, no story of violence the bones can plainly tell. The arrangement suggests urgency. Something moved through these communities faster than ritual could keep pace. When modern science meets such graves, it begins its careful search. Teeth are sampled, dense bone is tested. Researchers look for the genetic traces of known pathogens: plague, tuberculosis, brucellosis, anything that might have left a molecular fingerprint. Sometimes they find nothing conclusive. That absence can feel frustrating, but it also reveals something profound. Not every epidemic leaves a recoverable signature. Some viruses vanish too completely. Some bacteria degrade beyond recognition. Some diseases may have disappeared from the earth entirely. What remains is pattern. A settlement occupied for generations is suddenly interrupted. A burial pit fills in haste. Domestic life stops, and afterward the place is abandoned, as though the survivors chose distance over memory. That decision may be one of the clearest clues we have. It suggests not just mortality, but fear deep enough to make home itself feel unsafe. Something happened there that people did not want to meet again. There is a special sorrow in these unknown epidemics because they deny us the comfort of diagnosis. We cannot place them neatly in a textbook. We cannot say with certainty what symptoms came first, how it spread, or why one village suffered while another endured. The dead offer evidence, but not explanation. And perhaps that silence matters. It reminds us that human history is fuller than our records, and suffering is often greater than what can be named. If entire communities were undone by diseases we can no longer identify, then how much of the past has been shaped by forces that left only graves, abandonment, and the enduring ache of unanswered questions? What did ancient people believe when illness seemed to come not from a wound, not from an animal, but from the ordinary fabric of life itself? Before science offered language like pathogen, incubation, or transmission, people still observed patterns. They noticed that some sicknesses followed seasons. Others seemed to move within households. Some changed the face. Some emptied the body with fever. Some lingered so long they blurred into personality, weakness, or fate. Prehistoric communities may not have understood microbial causes, but they were not living without interpretation. They were building meaning from repetition, fear, and memory. It is possible that many early rituals began there, in the uneasy space between observation and explanation. A body is washed in a particular way. A dwelling is avoided after a death. Certain foods are forbidden during illness. Smoke is used, herbs are burned, water is approached with reverence or suspicion depending on the season. None of this required germ theory. It required only the human instinct to search for order when suffering appears arbitrary. What is striking in the archaeological record is that fear did not always produce cruelty. Again and again, we find evidence of care. The chronically ill buried with dignity, the disabled surviving longer than they could have alone, the dead placed deliberately rather than discarded. This does not mean prehistoric life was gentle. It means that compassion existed even without understanding. In some cases, perhaps because understanding was incomplete, people answered mystery not only with avoidance, but with ritual, closeness, and shared endurance. That truth matters because it unsettles a modern assumption. We often imagine knowledge as the sole foundation of humane behavior, but long before anyone knew why disease spread, people were already making moral choices in its presence. They were deciding whom to keep near, whom to feed, how to bury, and how to remember. And maybe that is one of the deepest continuities in human history. We do not wait for certainty before responding to suffering. We create stories, boundaries, symbols, and acts of care in the dark. The science changes. The question beneath it does not. How do we live together when the forces that threaten us remain partly unseen? What if the real story of prehistoric disease is not about isolated illnesses, but about a turning point in what it meant to be human? As people settled, planted, stored grain, domesticated animals, and remained in one place long enough to bury their dead in remembered ground, they changed more than the landscape. They changed the architecture of exposure. Shared roofs meant shared breath. Stored water meant stagnant risk. Herds brought nourishment, but also microbial trespass. Larger communities created safety from predators and strangers, yet they also offered something new to bacteria and viruses: continuity. This is the paradox at the heart of early civilization. Every advance that made life more stable also made disease more creative. To live close was to love close, work close, raise children close, and suffer close. Pathogens did not merely interrupt this new way of life. They adapted to it. Some learned to persist silently in bloodlines. Others thrived in crowded dwellings. Still others crossed from animals into humans because we had redrawn the boundary between species with our own hands. And yet this was not a mistake. Humanity could not become fully human, at least not in the social, cultural, and emotional sense we now recognize, without accepting the risks of nearness. Villages, rituals, memory, craft, kinship, agriculture, all of it depended on repeated contact. Disease was part of the price of connection, but connection was also the source of care, endurance, and collective meaning. The same intimacy that allowed infection to spread also allowed survival to be shared. Perhaps that is why the evidence feels so modern. The ancient world was not separate from us. It was the beginning of the same bargain we still live with now. The more linked we become, the more vulnerable we are to what moves among us unseen. But we are also more capable of protecting, warning, and carrying one another through it. So the deeper question is not whether disease shaped civilization. It clearly did. The deeper question is whether civilization itself can be understood as humanity's ongoing attempt to live meaningfully despite the invisible forces that have accompanied us from the beginning. So what do these ancient diseases finally ask of us? Not merely to look backward in horror, but to recognize continuity. The bent spine, the scarred face, the fevered village. the hurried grave near a riverbank. None of these belong to a vanished world as completely as we might wish. They are part of a longer human story in which illness has always been more than biology. It has shaped movement, ritual, fear, caregiving, memory, and the fragile structures people build to remain together when life becomes uncertain. The deeper lesson of prehistory is not that our ancestors were helpless. It is that they were observant, adaptive, and profoundly human in the face of what they could not yet explain. They noticed patterns. They created meanings. They experimented with plants, customs, distances, and acts of care. Even without science, they were already engaged in the first version of the same struggle we know today: how to live responsibly inside a world filled with invisible forces. Modern medicine gives us language they did not have, but it does not release us from the emotional logic they knew so well. We still fear contagion. We still search for causes. We still attach stories to illness, some wise, some cruel. And even now, with all our knowledge, pathogens continue to evolve beside us, reminding us that certainty is never permanent. The ancient world is not a closed chapter. It is the opening movement of a conversation we are still having. Perhaps that is why the bones feel so moving. They do not only testify to suffering, they testify to endurance. Someone survived long enough for bone to heal. Someone was buried with care. Someone remained part of the group even while changing in ways no one understood. Across thousands of years, that may be the most important truth of all. Disease has always traveled with humanity, but so have curiosity, compassion, and the stubborn refusal to let mystery have the final word. If the past teaches anything, it is this: we were never shaped by microbes alone. We were shaped also by how we chose to face them, remember them, and keep one another human in their shadow.